There was always fame. As long as there have been human beings, there has always been fame. It's a human weakness. No other kind of living creature knows anything about fame, not even the peacock, who certainly craves attention but lacks the brain to know why. When prehistory turned to history, famous people became, almost by definition, the first kind of people posterity got to hear about. Indeed, it wasn't until recent times that the writing of history began to concern itself with anyone except famous people and the things they did. In the 20th century, however, fame turned into something different. Suddenly, there was more of it. Just when scientific progress was supposed to be ridding the world of myths and ghosts, famous people became larger than life. A special word was brought in for the extra light that the famous were thought to give off: charisma. When the century started, famous people were still required, as of old, to do something first, then get famous for it later. As the century progressed, people who became famous for what they did got more famous just for being famous. Elizabeth Taylor has been famous long enough to exemplify the transition from one state to the other. When she started off, she was famous for being a screen star. In her first big role, in National Velvet, when she was still really a child, her heart-shaped face caught the breath of all who saw the movie, and the whole family saw it, usually twice. Her violet eyes looked as if they had been specifically invented to test the possibilities of colour film. When she grew up and appeared as the young bride of the title in Father of the Bride, she had the ideal figure to go with the face, perfectly judged, not too much, but the camera couldn't get enough. Even then, some said she was more beautiful than talented. But even if she was just beautiful, she could be described as doing something. Today, she is famous for being Elizabeth Taylor. She gets married, usually to someone unsuitable. She gets married again, probably to someone more unsuitable. She champions a cause. She brings out a new fragrance. She is very busy, far too busy to make movies. The thing she got famous for is far in the past. Only the fame remains, but it is more attention-getting than ever. It has a life of its own. To lose the capacity for doing what made you famous in the first place need no longer spell the end of fame. Fame can conquer time. It can conquer death. Elvis Presley is a case in point. The conviction that he is still alive is not confined to California. There are women leading blameless lives in the western suburbs of Sydney who claim that Elvis makes love to them every Monday afternoon in a motel. He has been seen pushing a supermarket trolley in Basildon, or Brussels, or Bangkok, or Berlin. Elvis Presley's seemingly everlasting fame is part of our reality, for better or worse. But how did it all come about? At the start of the 20th century, the outstanding American newspaper tycoon was William Randolph Hearst. He solved the problem of how to satisfy the insatiable public desire for reading about famous people. He did it by making people famous, building up his friends as saints, and branding his enemies as monsters. Later on, by a satisfactory irony, Orson Welles handed Hearst the same treatment by portraying him as Citizen Kane. It was movable type, moving ever faster, that got the new kind of fame off the ground. Pictures went into the papers. But at the turn of the century, moving pictures were just a gleam in the laboratory. They flickered and fizzed in the garages and gazebos of gifted amateur scientists all over the world. The country most open to the exploitation of an inventor's discoveries, however, was America, homeland of Thomas Alva Edison. As far as the public was concerned, Edison invented moving pictures, and he invented recorded sound. Edison enjoyed standing in front of his own camera, and did it as often as possible. He was a pioneer of the home movie, but being filmed didn't make him famous. He was already famous for being a fertile inventor of new devices. He didn't necessarily invent what could be done with them, and was capable of violent jealousy if anyone looked like infringing his patents. If other people borrowed his moving picture idea to make featurettes for the new Nickelodeons, he charmingly sent strong-arm men to smash their equipment. It never occurred to him that his most extraordinary invention would ever make news by itself. And at the start, it didn't. The first movies were home movies, like Edison's own. Queen Victoria was already the most famous female monarch in the world since her compatriot Elizabeth I. Still photographs of Victoria were displayed in silver frames on top of mahogany pianos in every corner of the world's biggest empire. In her final hours she made a movie, but it added nothing to her fame. It wasn't seen outside Balmoral. The same applied to the Russian novelist Count Leo Tolstoy. His books were translated while he was still alive. He was as famous as Dickens. The only film footage he had time to appear in didn't make him any more famous. It wasn't news. Caruso's fame could scarcely have been bigger. He made some of the first gramophone records, and millions of people who never saw him sing in the opera house did hear him sing at home. Wives who didn't like the noise their husbands made in the bath said, "Who do you think you are, Caruso?" But a few scraps of film had nothing to do with that. All he did on celluloid was fool around for his friends. It wasn't news. Getting the motion picture camera to where the news was happening, getting the film back again to where it could be developed, and then getting the developed film back again to where it could be shown, all needed quick transport, and the means of quick transport was still being invented. When the Wright brothers made their first flight in 1903, there was no motion picture camera there to catch it. The movie camera didn't arrive until they flew again. America was too big. Even the fastest of the new automobiles could cross only a little bit of it in a day. For just a moment, a small country like France had the advantage. The French had a newsreel system up and running when their most intrepid team of aviators, Louis Blériot and his formidable moustache, prepared to fly the English Channel. Amid maximum tohu-bohu, the French for brouhaha, Blériot set off to battle the air resistance created by his formidable moustache. He made it and became world famous, but he stayed world famous only in France. He didn't make fame a career. He was content to be a French national hero. Madame Curie was a French national heroine. She discovered radium. She won the Nobel Prize and every other prize and was proud of her calling, but she wasn't interested in fame. 30 years had to go by before the Americans finally managed to immortalize her. Greer Garson starred as Madame Curie with Walter Pidgeon as her husband Pierre. It was one of a string of movies known in the trade as Garson Pigeons, and neither Garson nor the studio had any idea of making the great scientist look realistically haggard. Instead, they made her human. The real Madame Curie already was human, and the Greer Garson version transparently wasn't, but that was what fame did. It simplified what was real so that people could take it in. In America, where the people ruled, the century was only a few years old when an ambitious politician realized the possibilities. Teddy Roosevelt started his build-up to the presidency by gleefully cooperating with any printed organ which would run his photograph. He smelt votes, and his whiskers bristled. He was so vibrant that the pictures almost moved. When the pictures did move, Teddy was quick to get into them. He was a complicated, brainy man who realized that a simple, manly image would win him fame, and fame would win him elections. He provided the first presidential photo opportunity for a motion picture camera. It proved to be an opportunity for the cameraman to be almost flattened by a falling tree. With his early example in mind, later presidents learned to be performers. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy. Later, a performer learned to be president. Ronald Reagan. Looking back, it seems logical that if a president of the United States turned himself into a star, he would open a window of opportunity through which a star would one day emerge as President of the United States. But stardom had a long way to go before that happened. In the early 1900s, the people in the movies were just little figures on a screen, smaller than the people who were sitting in the dark watching. But then something happened that turned 20th century fame into something else, the close-up. It made cinematograph performers into stars. It could make anyone into a star. 20th century fame isn't just about Hollywood. Some of the most famous people of the century never made a movie, but they have all been in the movies because one of the things that made them famous was the film camera's ability to make the face so big. Larger than life, it took on more meaning than it had in reality. With the close-up film face, there was no limit to the imagination's involvement. Radiant in the distance, yet close enough to taste, the people in the close-up were symbolic, but what they symbolized was the people watching them. You know these people so well, you can't believe they don't know you. They don't, of course. They never did. Nobody could become a star without being cut off from the mass of people who were going to buy the tickets. 20th century fame has tended to unite bigger and bigger audiences while making those who possess it more isolated. The process began early, with the Hollywood star system. When the close-up came in, old-style acting ability went out. It was useful, but it wasn't essential. What was essential was looks. Perfectly ordinary people who looked good turned up in Hollywood from all over America and soon from all over the world. A few of them were cut out of the herd and became stars. In those very first years of the close-up, between 1908 and 1910, a huge audience could recognize the Biograph girl, but they didn't know her name. The Biograph studio issued a statement denying that Florence Lawrence had been killed in a streetcar accident. Actually, no one had ever suggested that she had. It was a publicity stunt staged by the studio. It worked. Florence Lawrence became a famous, if not very likely, name. Francis X. Bushman, William S. Hart, Theda Bara, whose name was an anagram for Arab death. Most of them are now forgotten. At the time, they were part of the scenery. Some of them acted like it, but they were all heroes. They looked like heroes. Looking the part was what they did. They were up there looking handsome or looking lovely. It was easy for them to look handsome and lovely because that was what they were. But above all, they were heroic, in control of life, on behalf of the audience, who weren't. 20th century fame, this new centrifugal force which seemed to suck everything into show business before squirting it out again, was still confined to America. Europe continued producing the old-style heroes, real ones who actually did things, even if they didn't do them very well. Intrepid, if inept, none was more heroic than Britain's redoubtable Antarctic explorer, Robert Falcon Scott. Though hopeless when it came to the petty practical details which merely meant the difference between life and death for his colleagues, Scott was aware of the value of publicity and took film cameras with him as far south as he could. But he died out of reach of the lens, leaving only a diary. The diary later became a bestseller and helped to establish Scott as a hero in the old style, waging a private, lonely interior battle with destiny. His blunders were forgotten. He was enshrined as an example of the best type of British officer, with a stiff, indeed frozen, upper lip. Soon afterwards, World War I started. It was a strictly European event. America wasn't interested. As the slaughter commenced, the news was dominated by 19th century-style moustaches. Behind them were the men in charge, but you could hardly see them. Kaiser Wilhelm was the chief German moustache. Reputedly he was crazy, but it was hard to tell. The top French moustache was Marshal Foch. He was billed as a military genius, and might have looked like one without all the facial hair. Great Britain's leading moustache was King George V. With a beard to complement his moustache, he was known to all by name, yet utterly invisible. Britain's prime ministerial moustache was Lloyd George. He was a brilliant orator, but since there was no sound, film, or any radio at the time, you had to be there to hear him. And he wasn't there in the front line. He was safely at home, seducing women. As the total of dead mounted into millions, gradually it became apparent that the great moustaches wouldn't do as heroes. The fighting man was the hero. He had to be a hero every day for as long as he lasted. But he didn't look like one. The average soldier was covered in mud. The average soldier was dead. Individuals were hard to find. They showed up above the battlefield in the form of ace pilots. Germany made a hero out of Baron von Richthofen, the Red Knight of the Air, so called because he flew into action in a little red Fokker triplane. The Red Baron was above the battle, in a neat little war of his own. The same sort of thing was permitted at the edge of the battle, in obscure places such as the Middle East, stamping ground of Lawrence of Arabia. He was T.E. Lawrence, a gigantic ego well camouflaged as a neurotically shy, short man. He had a knack for backing nervously into the limelight. The limelight was mainly provided by the American journalist Lowell Thomas. Thomas sent back reports about this exotic Englishman who dressed as an Arab prince and went tearing around the desert like Sir Galahad in a sheet. Lawrence's true fame, however, only happened 60 years later, when the movie came out. Though they had cast the part of one of the world's shortest heroes with one of the world's tallest actors, Peter O'Toole was at least a British actor, or British-ish. The film had a British director, David Lean, but it was an American movie. Boycotted by America, World War I went on exterminating its own extras in the modern manner without producing any stars who didn't look old hat. The Russian Revolution did better. It produced Lenin, or rather, Lenin produced it, and Lenin produced it in every sense. Lenin staged the revolution as a theatrical event as well as a political one. If he didn't personally arrange to give himself top billing, it was only because he didn't have to. Dutiful apparatchiks did it for him, making him the center of attention for a propaganda system which, right from the start, was the most efficient thing in the Soviet Union apart from the secret police. In the West, Henry Ford put his name on the century like no one else. He put America on wheels, and the whole world followed. The Ford Motor Company was the new America. Ford's fame went to his head. He rated himself an original thinker on world affairs. His critics were nearer the mark when they called him an anti-Semite and a hayseed. In his old age, when he seized the microphone and spoke, he just didn't match up to his own historical significance. Though Henry Ford had done more than Lenin to shape the 20th century, his voice came quavering out of the 19th, a time when what a man did was what counted, and his personality didn't have to match his renown. No less an industrial center than Ford's Detroit, Hollywood was more up to date. The Star System's production line turned out personalities too good for this world. Stardom was a parallel world ruled by the people in it, with no one below the rank of prince and princess. The king and queen were Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Pickford was America's sweetheart. She had innocence, along with a salary of $350,000 a picture. Fairbanks was the athletic hero. He had athleticism and teeth. Even off-screen, the couple were on-screen, living in a house on a hill that was like a castle, where all the world's famous people came to pay court. On-screen, the couple were a fairy tale. They chose their costumes from the vast walk-in wardrobe of the romantic past. They were modern heroes, but the heroes they played were a hangover from another era. The same applied to Rudolph Valentino. No man in history had aroused so much female desire, but he looked as if he came from history, or anyway from somewhere exotic. He was a gaucho who danced the tango. He was a bullfighter who got gored, but mainly he was the chic. He was Lawrence of Arabia with a degree in Latin American dancing. For the studio publicity department, Rudy was gold dust. They set up sex appeal tests to measure his cataclysmic effect on the female metabolism. Off stage, Valentino was obliged to keep up his performance as a great lover with magical powers of sexual attraction and infinite supplies of savoir-faire. He was in over his head. In real life, he had been a taxi dancer and freelance lounge lizard, but real life had been left far behind. He tried to take control of his own movies and had one financial disaster after another. Fame needed a business brain. Charlie Chaplin grasped this fact and became the first truly great figure of 20th century fame. His role as the tramp wasn't drawn from the romantic past or from some exotic land where they danced the tango in Arab headdress. The tramp was from the 20th century. Thanks to the nearly universal reach of silent film, he was the most recognizable figure on earth. The price of adulation was isolation. Chaplin found himself cut off from the mass of mankind that adored him. Only other famous people could behave naturally in his presence. Lord and Lady Mountbatten, making an early start on a long career of being noble friends to the famous, turned up to be included in a home movie. Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks were like little boys together because they were little boys together, living again the last time when they might have met each other by accident. When Fairbanks and Pickford toured Europe, they found to their horror that their loving public was ready to crush the life out of them. There was no way back from this kind of fame. As Chaplin had already guessed, the real story of 20th century fame would be how to live with it. But that didn't become clear until someone died of it. It was Valentino. If he had been operated on in time, he might have been saved, but they couldn't find a surgeon to match his prestige. It was the last farce of his life. His death was a theatrical triumph. People queued to get in. The funeral rites started in New York, where the queue to see his body became a riot. Valentino's body crossed the country by train. The funeral in Hollywood was one of the film world's events of the century, razzmatazz in mourning. But for millions of women all over the world, his loss was the occasion of deep and lasting grief, which pundits preferred to call mass hysteria, rather than face the difficult question of how otherwise normal people could feel love for a dreamed object, passion for an illusion, and treat the life and death of a man who wore funny hats as if it were a matter of life and death. It was the death of innocence. Fame was a force, and the proof was in the coffin. But as the years between the wars began, America wasn't yet the deciding factor in 20th century fame. Older countries still had their pride and could prove it. They were bang up to date. Suzanne Lenglen was 5 times Wimbledon champion. If she had entered for the Olympic high jump, she would have won that too. She wasn't American, she was French. Anna Pavlova toured the world with her Dance of the Dying Swan. The swan died 1,000 times to overwhelming applause. She wasn't American, she was Russian. Dame Nellie Melba, no longer in her first youth but still energetic, made the world's first radio broadcast. The toast named after her is still consumed to this day. She wasn't American, she was Australian. Amy Johnson flew solo all the way to Australia. When she got there, she spoke a language the Australians understood, although it didn't sound like their language or any other language spoken by an ordinary human being. She sounded as if her mother had been to school with Queen Mary. It was the language of empire. The British Empire was one big happy family because most of its children were seen and not heard. But they were allowed to play together, even if they were different colours. The game they played was called cricket, and only people who belonged to the British Empire could understand it. Nobody outside the British Empire had any idea why these men in white were running backwards and forwards, or talking a lot of incomprehensible jargon about hitting each other in the bails with a googly to the inside leg. The famous names of cricket were famous as far as the Empire went, and no further. Since the Empire went quite far, it was practically world fame. But in America, a sportsman achieved world fame in a sport played scarcely anywhere else except in his own country. Babe Ruth was the greatest name in baseball. He won the World Series for the Yankees. Cricket-loving cynics in Britain might have said there was nobody else in the World Series except Yankees, but at least the British got to hear about him, whereas no American ever got to hear about Jack Hobbs or Donald Bradman. The reason was that Babe Ruth wasn't just good at baseball, he was good at being a celebrity. The celebrity was yet another pioneering American contribution to 20th century fame. Celebrities weren't just famous for what they did, they were famous for the lives they led while they did it. The celebrity sportsman was famous for being human. Babe Ruth was human in a big way. In 1921, his signing-on fee for the Yankees was $125,000, and he had already spent half of it on hot dogs. An America hungry for Babe Ruth statistics was told how many hot dogs he ate and how fast, along with how many home runs he hit and how often. His fame didn't just have quality, it had quantity. Baseball got written into the plots of movies. During World War II, American troops on the Pacific Islands heard Japanese soldiers shouting during the night that Babe Ruth would die in the morning. At first glance, Charles Lindbergh was a gift from heaven, for the omnivorous new means of mass communication. He was as good-looking as any film star, and his wings didn't come from the prop department. He was real. He was patriotic. He was perfect. The whole of America flew with him across the Atlantic. His progress was tracked on the London, Amsterdam, and Tokyo Stock Exchange ticker tapes. The press and the newsreels believed that they had helped to build Lindbergh up, and there was something to it. The idea of flying solo across the Atlantic wasn't a lonely dream. It was a competition with $25,000 in prize money. It could have been won by somebody else. It could have been won by René Fonck, a French war hero whose attempt to fly the Atlantic was foiled only because he took too many croissants with him. The plane was too heavy to take off. If he had travelled light, the name of Fonck would have resounded through the 20th century. You could call it the Fonck factor. The single heroic deed could always be done by another person. So the media couldn't help believing that Lindbergh owed them something when they called him a hero. They wanted cooperation in return. The story started going sour when Lindbergh didn't give it to them. Before his great flight to immortality, his taciturnity had been a plus. Now it was a minus. The media, which had sung hosannas to his silence, now wanted him to say something, and the same silence looked like ingratitude. He was the same man, but the rules had changed. The media wanted the show to go on. Its hero wanted it to be over. Lindbergh didn't enjoy fame. He couldn't hide, so he tried to run. But when Lindbergh and his new wife arrived in Japan, the cameras were waiting. The Lone Eagle was already finding to his cost that 20th century fame was a show you couldn't get out of once you had been cast in a starring role. He just didn't want to be in the limelight. But there were plenty of people who did. Prohibition made America's gangsters into headline news. The bad guys became big celebrities. Scarface Al Capone was the baddest guy, so he became the biggest celebrity. He loved the part and dressed up for it. The media couldn't get enough of him. Compared to the cops he had corrupted with payoffs, Capone looked honest. Apart from the people who were actually getting beaten up or rubbed out, the whole world seemed to like the idea that at least one man was up there above the daily grind. Capone was beyond good and evil. He was in show business. As if to prove the point, the film studios rewrote his life a dozen different ways. Film stars wanting to play him formed a queue 70 years long. Paul Muni, Edward G. Robinson, Rod Steiger, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. They changed the story and they changed the setting, and sometimes they even changed Capone's name, but it was still him. Capone is a classic. He's lasted longer than Lindbergh, and it's because fame suited him. He needed fame. It was a step up. It was a step up for honest people, too. The great black jazz musicians were down there in the lowlife of Prohibition America, and if they wanted the status they had coming to them, they had to go with the story. The only problem was how far. When Louis Armstrong's long career ended, he was the most famous jazz musician in the world. For millions of people who didn't know much about jazz, he was the voice and the face they knew. People who did know about jazz said that he had thrown away his art and there was nothing left except showmanship. But they seldom asked why that was. The answer was that when the man famous for singing Wonderful World was starting off, the world wasn't so wonderful. In the land where Armstrong lived, white men controlled the record business and stole most of the money. To stay solvent, the artist had to become an entertainer. So Louis Armstrong, the revolutionary modern musician, turned into Satchmo, the showman. The price of celebrity was to be stuck in the role. Armstrong had to be hail fellow well met, no matter what. Fame was a frame-up. In the great cities of Europe, America still seemed far away. From Paris, it was a dot on the horizon. America had the money, but as far as culture went, Lindbergh might as well have stayed home. The fame of the young American writer Ernest Hemingway began in Paris. He went there to write about the condition of modern man, and journalists went there to write about him. He was there because a few dollars bought a lot of francs, and because America was too small for him. He wanted to be famous, but on his terms. The Irish writer James Joyce was in Paris because his own country banned his books, and in Paris the dollars he borrowed from his rich American female patrons bought more whiskey and cigars. In Paris he published the kind of novel your mother thought was incomprehensible filth. And Pablo Picasso was in Paris because if he had stayed in Spain, his early struggles might have gone on for the rest of his life. In Paris he fulfilled himself creatively and was a big hit at the same time. The American expatriate Gertrude Stein helped make him world famous for painting the kind of pictures your mother thought were incomprehensible daubs. But in Paris, the elite were either clever enough to understand him or scared of looking stupid if they said they didn't. In the 20s, the news from Paris got to America within the month because the Paris editions of the new glossy magazines like Vogue and Harper's were owned in America. American money bought European style. The Europeans thought they were getting the best of the bargain, protecting their traditional cultures and getting paid for it. British actors enjoyed the prestige generated by speaking a version of the English language that Americans applauded for its sophistication. "And how was India?" asked Gertie. "Very big," replied Noel. In 1925, Noel Coward had 3 plays on in London, but the West End was just an out-of-town tryout for New York. He starred in his own plays on Broadway, too. It was where the fame was. European theatrical stars had once toured America to make money when they were washed up. Now they came at the height of their careers. As a showcase for theatrical stars, Broadway was bigger than London. Hollywood was bigger than either, but it couldn't talk. Not until October 1927, when The Jazz Singer, a movie with only half a soundtrack, revealed the full talent of Al Jolson. Jolson already had national fame as a Broadway musical star whose stock in trade was the kind of energy that couldn't be stopped by gunfire, and a blackface act that graphically demonstrated what Louis Armstrong was up against. Sound film turned Jolson from a crass vaudeville headliner into a world-famous crass vaudeville headliner. The Marx Brothers would have remained stars of radio and Broadway if it hadn't been for sound film. Harpo was essentially a silent comedian plus a motor horn. But Groucho talked. He had always been written up as a famous wit. Now the cinema audience could judge for itself how witty he was. It was through the movies that Groucho established his world fame as a master of the wisecrack. Self-exiled in London, the American-born poet T.S. Eliot might otherwise never have come to admire him. As it was, the 2 men formed a lasting friendship. It was a hint that world fame could be a kind of community in itself. Some experts said that Mae West was a man. Others said that she had been George Washington's mistress. But nobody ever said anything as good as what she said. She supplied most of her own dialogue and delivered it with enough eye-rolling suggestiveness to disguise the fact that she didn't really look very sexy. She just sounded it. Her style was innuendo con brio. At the same time, she had a sharp tongue that could tell Cary Grant to go jump in the lake or else to come up and see her sometime. The latter phrase being one she never pronounced in those exact words, but that's the way the phrase got famous, in a not uncommon instance of the folk memory supplying the rhythm that the original lacked. People had to be told that Cary Grant came from England. They thought he was just an American who talked in a sophisticated manner. America had absorbed enough class and gloss. Now it was producing its own. But there was a big difference. American classiness was classless. It was aimed at the masses, with no apologies. America's Stravinsky was George Gershwin. He had all the talent of a composer in the classical tradition. If he had been born in Europe, it would have been a scandal for him to get mixed up with musical theatre. Born in America, he took to Broadway without missing a beat. He took it over. He loved it all, the razzmatazz and the fame. He loved the girls, and they loved him right back. When Hollywood called, Gershwin answered. He didn't think his art was being corrupted. He thought it was being developed. He was right. American popular art had always had energy, but now it had eloquence. It could provide a setting for the American popular hero that made him irresistible, even if, like Fred Astaire, he had few of the attributes of the pre-sound matinee idol. Astaire didn't look all that different from the ordinary guy in the audience. He could do extraordinary things, but he did them in an ordinary way, with no histrionics. The Fred and Ginger dance poem was the sheer expression of uncomplicated joy. Projected all over the planet by Hollywood's worldwide distribution system, it made America look like a democratic paradise, where a shy guy with an ordinary face like his could dance like that and get a girl like her. Astaire acted shy on screen, but he could get away with acting shy off-screen only because the publicity apparatus was protecting him. Shyness fitted his ordinary guy image. Charles Lindbergh, who really was the shy American hero, or seemed to be, though some who came into contact with him said he was merely arrogant, was wide open. The press just kept on coming. Lindbergh and his wife dutifully posed for photo opportunities celebrating the arrival of their baby. He honestly thought that if he gave the press something today, they would stay away tomorrow. But as Lindbergh found out in the cruelest possible manner, the real trouble wasn't with the papers and magazines that printed the family photos. It was with some of the people who read them. Some of them were more than just curious. A few of them were crazy, and one of the crazy ones was a killer. When the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, the biggest story of the century, the one about the lonely flyer, took off all over again. The media did the same sort of job on him that they had done before. The indiscriminate nature of 20th century fame was clearly demonstrated to anyone cool enough to take stock. But no one was that cool. Everyone climbed aboard the bandwagon. Al Capone, in prison at the time, offered a reward for the kidnapper's apprehension. When the baby's body was found, the Lindbergh legend took on a new, permanent lease of life, through death. At the trial, the alleged killer was Bruno Hauptmann. Hauptmann almost certainly didn't do it, but he got the role as the first in a regrettably long line of 20th century assassins who achieved celebrity by murdering celebrities. Famous Americans were already worried that the fans might overwhelm them. Now they had to face the possibility that there might be some fans who studied the magazine photographs of the famous person's lovely new house, looking for a way in. Fame American style suddenly looked helpless, like America itself. In Europe, a new breed of hero had more contempt than ever for America's culture of the common man. The uncommon man was on his way. First, there was Mussolini. He had been strutting his stuff since 1922, when he led the fascist march on Rome and found a power vacuum into which he expanded like a balloon full of hot air. But Mussolini wasn't all talk. His first claim to fame was that he made the trains run on time, a feat he accomplished by beating up a few carefully chosen helpless victims. He was also master of the judicious murder, not on a mass scale, just the carefully chosen liberal opponent. But he was almost all talk. Fascism depended on appealing to the people by turning politics into a show in which they had a permanent role as extras. Mussolini played most of the leading characters himself. He was a statesman, he was a horseman, he was a musical genius. He designed his own costumes. He showed a particular flair with hats. He also knew when to take his clothes off in order to display his magnificent torso. He was sexually irresistible. The fascist movement was essentially a movie by Cecil B. DeMille. The Irish playwright and pundit George Bernard Shaw had achieved fame for his piercing insight. He praised Mussolini for his powers of decision. Shaw was well aware that these powers of decision were dictatorial. Mussolini was il duce, the leader. Shaw rather liked that idea. The dictator was an actor, and Shaw was fond of drama. Intellectuals like Shaw weren't the only non-Italian admirers of Mussolini. There was a German politician who watched everything Mussolini did, convinced he could do even better. In 1933, Adolf Hitler conquered Germany with a bigger show than Mussolini had ever dreamed of. Hitler was a self-proclaimed Superman who told his followers they were Supermen too. He raved on about a new race of 7-foot-tall, blue-eyed blondes with big muscles and even bigger husbands. His own personal appearance was rendered significant only by the flopping cowlick, the dust-bug moustache, and the pointed eyeballs common among people for whom anti-Semitism counts as a complex political theory. Yet his admirers, numbered in millions, never noticed the contradiction. he mesmerized them. Hitler was a ham actor, but he had timing. It was his idea to enter a rally always from the rear of the auditorium, so that he appeared to emerge from between the people as the expression of their desires, the embodiment of their dreams about a better fate. And above all, he knew how to time a speech. In this department he improved on Mussolini, whose speeches started big and stayed big, sharing the formal properties of a salami. Hitler started small. He started by not talking at all. While he stood there, the audience, already driven berserk by his sidekick, Rudolf Hess, gradually calmed down. Waiting, Hitler looked like the ordinary man, faced with too big a task. The audience grew apprehensive. What if he gave up, went home to Austria, changed back into lederhosen, and spent the rest of his life raising wolfhounds? All Germany held its breath as one. Into the silence, Hitler launched his first soft words, the grammar dubious, the sentiments execrable, but the voice, even at such a low pitch, already as brain-curdling as Kulminator, the most fatal brew of the Munich beer festival. As the hour-long speech progressed, Hitler pretended to draw energy from the adoring crowd in the arena and the millions of theoretically enthralled listeners clustered around the radios at home. He became an extraordinary man, a man possessed, gripped by his tremendous vision of a superior Aryan race battling against the world Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to invade Germany and open a kosher restaurant flying the hammer and sickle on every street corner. Once again, Bernard Shaw avowed that he admired a dictator's powers of decision. People who knew Hitler was evil were still impressed by his success. He was supremely powerful and supremely famous. In America, power and fame were still two separate things. Power was in Washington, and fame was in Hollywood. The only fully equipped American Superman was in the movies, Tarzan of the Apes. Johnny Weissmuller was of German extraction, and if he had been raised in Germany, he would have provided Hitler with a stunning example of what the master race looked like with its clothes off. But Weissmuller was raised in America and got the job of Tarzan instead. He started off as an Olympic swimmer who won so many gold medals he could stay fit just carrying them around, and he had a face off the front porch of the Parthenon. In one low-budget movie after another, he fought to gain the upper hand over Tarzan's deadliest enemy, the dialogue. Even the most famous exchange of dialogue in a Tarzan movie, "Me Tarzan, you Jane," wildly overstates the complexity of what he actually said. He said, "Tarzan, Jane." The king of the jungle was a sportsman turned actor, and the jungle he was king of was a studio 100 yards across at its widest point. This was where dreams of omnipotence belonged, in dreamland. In Europe, the eyebrows of the highbrows were raised in derision at America's culture of daydreams. But there was one big advantage in confining the daydreams to culture. It kept them out of politics. In America, the man in charge didn't have to be a Superman. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would have been better casting in the role of a Superman than any of the European dictators. But he didn't want the part. He left all that stuff to Tarzan. Roosevelt was a different sort of strongman. What made Roosevelt exceptional was his revolutionary trick of talking intimately to everybody all at once. He did it through the radio, in a regular feature known as the fireside chat. Though a recording of it might sound stilted by the folksy standards of a more practiced age, Roosevelt's fireside chat was fundamentally different from a dictator's ranting broadcast. FDR wasn't out to establish his own superiority. He wanted the listeners to appreciate their importance, not his. At any rate, he made it sound as if he did. There was an element of flattery, but there was a bigger element of fraternity. One common man was speaking to all the others, as if it was only a fluke that had put him where he was. The press knew that FDR was a showman. They forgave him because it was a great show. The press knew that FDR had been crippled by polio and couldn't stand up without leg braces, but they never talked about it. Even when he appeared on behalf of polio charities, the effects of the disease on him were never mentioned. It takes less than a minute to see all the film footage showing the extent of FDR's affliction that has ever reached the screen. Roosevelt was far from being a perfect man. 40 years later, he would never have been elected. In the long run, FDR's very success in making himself so famous helped to ensure that no candidate for the presidency of the United States could hope to escape the full glare of media attention. At the time, it was part of his charm that in the era of superhumans, he sounded human.